Hello everyone, welcome to the Smart Student channel. I'm happy you're here. My name is Chelsea, and in today's video, we're going to talk about the Works Cited page for MLA 9th edition. In other words, we're going to talk about how to create those full reference list entries corresponding with the in-text citations we talked about in the previous video. And I've said this for all of these videos for MLA formatting, and I'm going to say it one more time, but you have the option to download the 9th edition handbook because I have a PDF link down in the description for you. But for starters, I have a few opening points to make that you need to know, and then we're going to jump into my computer to go through all the examples I have cooked up for you. Sound good? Let's go. All right, so first things first, why do we need that full reference list entry anyways? Well, it's how you credit the authors in your text whose material you're pulling from. So if you're paraphrasing or directly quoting, then you must have the full reference list entry and the corresponding in-text citation. This is simply a protocol for research where all academics agree that this is how we're going to credit them. And so under MLA, what they refer to as reference list entries, or the elements that you need to include in it per se, it's called a container. And so within the container, there are 9 different elements. And don't worry, I'll say right off the bat that it's actually rare for a source to contain all of those 9 elements. The way I like to describe it is you want to fill up that container with as many elements that you have access to. So if you only have 4, that's fine. If you have all 9, fabulous. But that's what a container is, and we're gonna go through each of those different elements one at a time. By the way, these containers apply to any source you're trying to cite. Doesn't matter if it's a book, an article, a journal article, newspaper, social media, anything you're trying to cite, you're still looking for these same elements. And so that's why not always are those 9 elements gonna be present, because when you're trying to cite something, say like a TED Talk on a YouTube video versus an edited book chapter, well, there's going to be different elements available to you. But now let's go ahead and jump into my computer and walk through all of those elements one at a time. Okay, so here are our examples. And just to let you know what you're looking at, so on the left-hand side of the screen, I wanted to make sure we had all of the elements in a container listed so we can reference those. Because on the right-hand side, I have an example of each one of those, and we're going to walk through them one at a time. So the container element we're working on will be highlighted in yellow, and then the blue portion is going to be that element within the Works Cited entry. Let's go ahead and start with the first one of an author, or the author element, shall I say. This is the primary first element that comes in all Works Cited entries, if applicable, which is going to be most of them. So first things first, an author element, that's simply the creator of the work you're trying to cite. So this could be a writer, it could be a painter, a photographer, it could be a lot of different things. What you need to remember is who created the work. That's going to help you narrow down the author. Now, if you'll note, I have 3 different examples because these are the 3 most common scenarios that you'll run into. The most common scenario you'll run into is one author. And the correct way to format this is by listing out their last name first, followed by a comma, then their first name, ending the element with a period. However, go ahead and take a look at the 2 author example. I'm actually going to zoom in a little more. When you have 2 authors, if you'll note, the names are included differently. So let me explain this. The first author, you're going to keep the formatting the same as if this were only one author. So you want to start with their last name first, followed by a comma, followed by their first name. But instead of using a period to end the element, you're going to use a comma to signify that the element is not finished, that you have another author. To include that second author, you're going to type out the word and then note how you now type out their name, first name, last name, then following by that period to end the element. This may seem strange, but the logic that MLA uses is all Works Cited entries are alphabetized based on the author's last name, which is why you want to keep the first author the way it is traditionally, and then go ahead and type out the second author in the normal way that you would type this name out so the readability is easier. That's the only reason MLA suggests including their two names a little differently. But now let's talk about what to do when you have 3 or more authors. And the nice thing about this is this will apply if you have 3 authors or 33 authors. It doesn't matter on the number as long as there's 3 or more. What you're going to do is include the first author listed just as normal, just as before. Last name first, comma, first name. You're going to include a comma because there's more to the element. And what you're going to do then is include et al. With a period in place of all the other authors listed. Et al. Is the abbreviated Latin version of the word and others. This is why it's appropriate and suggested in this scenario. Okay, let's go ahead and move on to the next example, which is the title of source element. And I'm actually going to address title of source and title of container together because they're closely related. So let me see if I can explain this effectively. The title of the source is the work you're trying to cite. Now the title of the container, that is a work that contains another work. So not all sources will have the title of the container because, for example, let's say you're trying to cite a journal article. The journal article is going to be the source. The journal itself is going to be the title of the container. If you're trying to cite a podcast episode, the episode is going to be the source, and the podcast that belongs to is going to be the container. So in this example, Carrot Legs is a short story. In Guernica, that's going to be the title of the container that contains that short story. A couple other important things to note is that not all sources are going to have a container. So you're only going to include the container element if it's applicable to the piece of work that you're trying to cite. Also, please note how they're italicized. The reason is that MLA wants you to italicize the primary source that the work is located. So in this first example, there is no container, so go ahead and italicize the title of the source. In the second example, where there is a container, you want to italicize that rather than the title of the source element. Finally, the last thing to note is that the title of the source concludes with a period while the title of the container uses a comma. The reason for this is that the author and the title of the source elements are primary elements that will always be included in your works cited entries. All of these 9 elements in the container are optional, they're variable. In other words, not all of the sources you cite will contain all 9 of these, so if they're missing it, you simply omit it. That's why there is a comma separating all of the container elements. Yes, there is a period after the 9th element, the location. Keep in mind that if there is no location, the period is going to come after the last element in your container to finish out the works cited entry in its entirety. I hope that made sense. All right, let's go ahead and move on down the line and let's talk about the 4th element, the contributor. So to put this simply, the contributor is simply going to be any other person, groups, organization even that contributed to the work while not being the primary creator. So some key contributors that you should be listing in your works cited entry might be a translator, an editor, maybe a director. Now, I do want to note that occasionally you may list a key contributor in the author element if the work you're discussing is collaborative. So in other words, you have a few key contributors that contributed equal amounts as the author did, the main creator. You have a few different types. The way you're going to include them is by including them after the main creator, so the author, and then you're going to label them appropriately. So for example, you might list the author and then edited by so-and-so. You'll know when to do this because if you do run into this scenario, generally you're going to know because the key contributor is going to be listed right next to the author element. So for example, you would have the author listed first and then edited by so-and-so. That would be an indicator that this editor, they contributed a lot to this piece of work and I should include them in the author element. Now, when it comes to formatting the contributor, you want to use the same principles of including names as if they were in your prose. So in other words, you're not going to invert these
contributors like you with the author element because they're not there to be alphabetized, if that makes sense. And if you'll note, there is a label in front of the contributors. So you want to use the appropriate label depending on what type of contributor they are. So it could be adapted by, choreographed by, created by, directed, edited, illustrated, narrated, translated. The list is endless. It simply needs to be what their contribution was to the piece of work. Lastly, there's a comma to finish out this element, in which you would move on to the next one, which is the version. The version simply refers to a source that has more than one form. So if, for example, is it an edited book? Is it an edition of a book? Are you referencing an ebook versus a hardcover? This is simply the type of source if it applies to your work. So in this example, it's an expanded edition. And yes, please note how we use the abbreviation ED period instead of typing out the full word edition. Version is very simple because you have this element followed by that comma, and that's all you need to include if it's applicable to the type of work you're citing. But moving on to the next element, a number. And so the number is applicable if what you're citing is a part of a sequence and uses some form of a numbering system. For example, is there a numbered volume, issue, episode, season? These are all numbering systems in which you'd want to include in your works cited entry. So in the example we have here, this is volume number 5. Please, again, note how we use the abbreviated version to label the type of number it is. So it's a volume, so we use VOL period, followed by the number that's applicable to the source. But moving on to the 7th element, which is going to be the publisher. Now, the publisher is simply the entity that's primarily responsible for producing the work. In other words, who made this piece of work available to the public? In the example here, Oxford University Press is the publisher who published this book that we're trying to cite. Other examples of a publisher might be a studio or a company when it comes to broadcasting a film or television show. Maybe it's an institution responsible for creating content on a website. It could be the theater company putting on a play. This is another one of the elements that really does depend on the type of work you're trying to cite. But again, what you need to remember is who is responsible for producing the work and making it available to the public. By the way, I will note that a lot of times the publisher's name, it might be omitted. And so anytime you're trying to cite a piece of work where there is no publisher given, simply omit it from your entry. This is why it falls under the variable elements in the container, because you may not be able to find it. Now, closely related to the publisher element is going to be the publication date. And quite frankly, you're most likely going to be able to find a publication date listed. And this is simply the date that's associated with when the version of the work you're citing was published. So please note that I did say version. So if you're using an edited book, you want to use the date where the edited book edition was published. And so it's important to keep that in mind, that you're looking for the date of the version of the work you're citing. And when it comes to what to include for the date, there are a list of different items to include if they're available to you. So it might be the year, as you see here, and that's it. That's all that was available in this example. That's fine. Now, it might be a day and a month, maybe a day, month, and the year if all of that is available to you. Some other types of dates you might use that you may not think of might be a season, perhaps, maybe a timestamp. It could be a range of dates or years. So keep in mind that there is a little flexibility on the publication date. You just need to think about, when was this piece of work published? But that brings us to the final element in the container, which is going to be the location of the work. And so what is the location? It is exactly what it sounds like. It's where that work is located. So in other words, if the reader reading your paper wants to look up this source, where would they find that? So there's a lot of different things this can be. Some of the most common being a page range or even just a page number. If it's an online work, it might be the DOI number or the URL link. If it's somewhere that you viewed this work, it would be the location where you viewed or heard it. So for example, is it a performance, a lecture, an artwork, a manuscript, and an archive? The list goes on and on. This is simply where the work is located.
And there you have it. That's everything you need to know, or at least the basics, about creating reference list entries in the Works Cited page for MLA 9th edition. This right now is going to be my final video in the MLA series, but if you're a subscriber and you've watched these and there's something else you want me to cover, feel free to comment it down below. If I get enough comments on something that you guys would like, I'm more than happy to cover it for you later on. But in the meantime, I will see you guys next week.